What does it take to change the mind of a die-hard socialist who's made it his life's mission to rail against capitalism, especially one who is a self-made millionaire? I mean, if Bernie Sanders wants to put any word ahead of his socialist label, it should be champagne, because Bernie Sanders is more of a champagne socialist than a democratic socialist. I'd wager to say he's also a caviar communist, but why rub it in? After all, I don't want to insult or vilify or much less demonize the old man. I most certainly don't want to add to any more of the political tribalism and divide in this country. I want to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. Which is precisely why I believe it's important to jump on the Bernie bashing bandwagon going on right now, which I agree is absolutely necessary. We need to denounce dictatorships in all their forms, and I'm glad to see more people are calling him out on his Castro regime apologetics, especially within the Democratic Party. And by the way, this not only matters to Cuban exiles living in Florida. See, I think it's also problematic when certain celebrities like Bill Maher criticize the Cuban exile community for calling out people who champion Fidel Castro as a hero. Bill Maher used to be one of my favorite comedians, but now I just see him as a smug, pompous prick. So much for not wanting to insult people in this video, but Bill Maher deserves a little smack back considering how condescending he could be with his own audience at times. And calling out Castro apologetics is also relevant to Venezuelan exiles escaping the collapse of their nation thanks to Hugo Chavez and Nicolas Maduro's unconscionably corrupt governments who were clearly influenced by the Castro regime. And this also matters to Nicaraguan exiles that escaped the Sandinista movement under the authoritarianism of Daniel Ortega. And it's also important to anyone and everyone who's ever had to escape an authoritarian regimes around the world. But just as important as it is to highlight the danger of mistaking the Castro regime's free education for anything other than an indoctrination program, which by the way would also use children to unwittingly denounce their own parents if they were against the government or were planning to leave the country. Just as important as it is to call that out, it's equally important to highlight when President Trump makes excuses for the truly horrific murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi that was almost definitely ordered by the current psychopathic pampered prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman Al Saud. It's also not good optics when Trump calls North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un a friend, or refuses to challenge another president/dictator Vladimir Putin of Russia for deliberately meddling within our election process. Not to mention the numerous murders of journalists and political opponents in his country. Yet Donald Trump has no problem talking and acting tough in front of the cameras, to be sure, to actual allies such as Angela Merkel from Germany, who happens to be a lady for crying out loud. But there is a big difference between DJ Trump downplaying the murder most likely ordered by the Saudi prince and Bernie Sanders praising the Castro regime's misleading literacy programs. Unfortunately, we cannot overthrow every single dictatorship in the world. Not only would it thoroughly bankrupt our nation, but there's always a vacuum of power open to yet another dictatorship. That's why it's a lot more important to keep the peace with nations and frenemies like Saudi Arabia, Russia, China, and even North Korea, especially if they have nuclear arsenals. It's an unfortunate reality about foreign policy, but sometimes it's better to bargain with the devil you know than the devil you don't if you want to avoid war. But that's the thing, we're not at all threatened by Cuba. And while I in no way, shape, or form am calling for the takeover of Cuba, considering the few family and friends that still reside in that socialist tropical gulag, there's no practical reason to praise the Castro regime by a presidential candidate like Bernie Sanders. And especially when that praise belies an inexcusable ignorance of why totalitarian regimes offer their people supposed free education and healthcare. By the way, I highly recommend reading The Dictator's Handbook, which explains in great detail why authoritarian regimes, especially communist ones, offer supposedly free healthcare and education. Because they have to. When autocracies don't allow private capital to operate in their country, their own people are the only resource they have to keep things running, not to mention to keep them in power. Which begs the question, why does a presidential candidate like Bernie Sanders at the tender age of 78 still not get this? And for anyone who defends Bernie Sanders by saying, well, at least he's been consistent in his ideals, that's precisely the problem. He's been consistently on the wrong side of history and the wrong side of logic for that matter. That's the whole joke behind this cartoon, the Fidel Castro litmus test. By the way, a litmus test is a simple experiment that tests for the acidity or alkalinity of a substance by using a litmus paper. And it's so effective in determining the pH balance of substances that it's become an analogy as well in politics, where potential candidates for high office are usually asked a single question to determine how qualified they are for that position. And just like a litmus test can determine an either-or proposition about someone's worldview, either Bernie Sanders is grossly misinformed about the Castro regime, or he's deliberately disinforming anyone who will listen to him. And either way, he's obviously on the wrong side of history and the wrong side of logic altogether. This man is clearly not the best person qualified to lead one of the world's greatest free market economies that's regulated by a constitutional democratic republican government. Like I said, I don't want to vilify or demonize, and much less add to the divide of political tribalism that is keeping us from solving our problems. But I have to say, Bernie Sanders seems just as dangerously hypocritical, opportunistic, and narcissistic as everyone thinks Donald Trump is as well. But like a broken clock is right twice a day, at least Trump is correct about issues that can make or break our country, namely the economy. And just like the unfortunate aspect of foreign policy pushes us to bargain with devils we know better than the devils we don't, if it comes down to Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump come November 2020, I know the lesser of two evils I'll be voting for. And since I also understand and appreciate the value of capitalism, this drawing is for sale, as well as other drawings and paintings of mine. Please check out the links down below if you're interested, and or please consider subscribing to my channel, and or give this video a thumbs up if you think it was worth it. Thanks for watching.